The wooden ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed toward the attic, my arthritic hands gripping each rung while Christmas music drifted up from the living room below. My daughter Sophia's laughter echoed through the house, mixing with her husband's deep voice and the excited squeals of my grandchildren. But none of that warmth was meant for me. In my trembling hand, I clutched a thin pillow in the scratchy blanket Sophia had thrust at me an hour earlier, her eyes cold as December frost. "The guest rooms are full, Mom," she'd said without looking up from her phone. "The attic has that old cot from when Marcus was younger. It'll have to do." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I paused halfway up the ladder, listening to the sounds of my family celebrating Christmas Eve without me, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my ribs, though they ached from the climb. Something deeper, something that had been breaking slowly for months, maybe years, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt final. What Sophia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 days ago I'd won $67 million in the state lottery. The ticket was still folded carefully in my wallet, unclaimed, unannounced. As I reached the top of the ladder and stepped into the cold, dusty attic space that would be my bedroom for Christmas, I realized that money wasn't just going to change my future, it was going to rewrite everything. My name is Angela Garcia, though everyone who truly knew me called me Angie. I'm 71 years old, and for most of my life I believed that family was everything. I raised Sophia as a single mother after her father Miguel died in a construction accident when she was only 8. Those early years were hard, filled with double shifts at the textile factory and nights spent helping her with homework at our tiny kitchen table. But they were also filled with something I thought would last forever: unconditional love. Sophia was my miracle child, born after 3 miscarriages that nearly broke my faith in God's plan. When the doctor finally placed her in my arms, wrinkled and red and perfect, I whispered a promise to her tiny ear. "Mija, you'll never want for anything. Mama will make sure of that." And I kept that promise, even when it meant eating rice and beans for dinner so she could have fresh fruit for lunch. Even when it meant wearing the same dress to church for 2 years, so she could have new school clothes each fall. I worked at Meridian Textiles for 38 years, my fingers moving across fabric samples and my eyes straining under fluorescent lights. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and it came with health insurance that covered Sophia's asthma medications and my high blood pressure pill. Every Friday, I'd cash my paycheck and divide it into carefully labeled envelopes: rent, groceries, utilities, and a small one marked Sophia's future, that I hid behind the coffee canister. Our little house on Maple Street wasn't much to look at from the outside: pale yellow paint peeling around the windows and a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side. But inside it was warm and filled with the smell of my grandmother's recipes. Pozole on Sundays, fresh tortillas every morning, and tres leches cake for every birthday and celebration. Sophia would sit at the counter while I cooked, telling me about her day at school, her dreams of becoming a lawyer, her first crush on Tommy Martinez from her biology class. Those were the golden years when she still needed me. When she'd crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and we'd pray the rosary together in Spanish, the words rolling off our tongues like music. When she'd bring me dandelions from the backyard and call them flowers for the most beautiful mama in the world. When she'd practice her quinceañera waltz with me in the living room, stepping on my feet and giggling until we both collapsed on the sofa, breathless with laughter. I saved every report card, every award, every photograph from school events. The box under my bed grew heavier each year, filled with evidence of her brilliance, her beauty, her promise. When she graduated valedictorian from Lincoln High, I cried so hard during her speech that Mrs. Rodriguez had to pass me tissue. "That's my daughter," I whispered to anyone who would listen. "That's my Sophia. College was supposed to be our triumph together." I'd saved enough in that coffee can envelope to cover her first year at the state university, and she'd earned a partial scholarship that would help with the rest. The night before she left for freshman orientation, we stayed up until dawn talking about everything and nothing. She painted my nails bright pink, the color she said reminded her of cotton candy and summer carnivals, while I braided her long black hair the way my mother had braided mine. "Promise me you'll call every Sunday," I said, holding her hands in mine. "Promise me you won't worry too much," she replied, squeezing my fingers. "I'm going to make you proud, Mama. I'm going to become someone important, and then I'll take care of you the way you took care of me." And she did make me proud. Dean's List every semester, internships at prestigious law firms, graduation cum laude with a degree in political science. When she was accepted to law school at Northwestern, I used my entire savings account to help her with the first year's tuition. It didn't matter that I'd have to work 5 more years before retirement. Seeing Sophia succeed was worth every sacrifice, every empty envelope. Every night I fell asleep worrying about bills. Law school changed her, though I didn't recognize it at first. Her calls became shorter, more focused on her grades and her stress than on our conversations. When she came home for Christmas during her second year, she spoke differently, using words I had to look up later in the dictionary I kept by my bed. She talked about her classmates like they were more sophisticated than the people from our neighborhood, including me. "Mama, you should really think about taking some English classes," she said one evening while I was making her favorite enchiladas. "Your accent is so thick sometimes. It might hold you back professionally." I stopped stirring the sauce and looked at her. "Hold me back from what, Mija? I'm 62 years old. I'm not looking for a new profession," she sighed, the kind of sigh that suggested I was being difficult. "I'm just saying when I graduate and start practicing law, I'll be meeting important people, clients, partners, judges. It would be nice if you could present yourself better." The words stung, but I told myself she was just stressed from school, that the pressure was making her say things she didn't mean. I enrolled in an ESL class at the community center the following week, not because I thought my English needed improvement, but because I wanted to make her proud. I wanted to be the kind of mother she wouldn't have to explain or apologize for. After law school, Sophia landed a position at a prestigious firm in the city, 2 hours away from our little house on Maple Street. She rented a modern apartment in a high-rise building with a doorman and a view of the river. When I visited for the first time, I felt like I was in a magazine, everything so clean and white and expensive looking. There were no family photos on her walls, no reminders of where she came from or who had helped her get there. "It's beautiful, Mija," I said, running my hand along her granite countertop. "You've done so well for yourself." "Thanks, Mama," she replied, but she was already checking her phone, already somewhere else in her mind. That's when I met Richard Blackstone III, the man who would become her husband and the architect of my exile from her life. Richard was everything I wasn't: tall, blonde, educated at private schools, born into wealth that stretched back generations. His family had old money, the kind that came with summer houses and charity galas and investments that grew themselves. When Sophia introduced us at a firm holiday party, his handshake was firm but brief, his smile polite but cold. "Mrs. Garcia," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from never having to ask for anything twice. "Sophia's told me so much about you." I doubted that was true, but I smiled anyway. "Please, call me Angie, and congratulations on your engagement. Sophia is very lucky to have found such a successful young man." Something flickered in his eyes then, something that told me he thought the luck was all on her side. That a girl from Maple Street with a factory worker mother should be grateful that someone like him had chosen her. I wanted to tell him that my daughter was brilliant, that she'd earned every opportunity she'd ever received, that her value had nothing to do with his approval. But I stayed quiet, the way I'd learned to stay quiet about many things where Sophia's new life was concerned. Their wedding was a grand affair, held at the Blackstone family estate in the hills outside the city. 200 guests, a string quartet, flowers flown in from Ecuador. I wore a navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, something elegant but not too flashy, something that wouldn't embarrass Sophia in front of Richard's family and friends. During the reception, I sat at a table near the back with Sophia's old high school friends, and a few distant cousins who'd made the drive from Los Angeles. When it came time for the mother-daughter dance, Sophia took my hand and led me to the center of the floor. For 3 minutes, as we swayed to "The Way You Look Tonight," she was my little girl again, the one who used to dance on my feet in our living room. She whispered, "I love you, Mama," in my ear, and I felt like everything we'd been through. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Every sacrifice and struggle had been worth it for this moment. But even then, even in that perfect moment, I could feel Richard watching us from the edge of the dance floor, his expression unreadable but somehow disapproving. As if our tenderness was a liability, our connection a threat to the new life he was building with my daughter. After the wedding, Sophia's calls became even less frequent. She was busy settling into married life, she said, learning to manage a household, entertaining Richard's business associates, volunteering for the right charity. When I did hear from her, she sounded different, her voice taking on the same clipped, efficient tone that Richard used when he spoke to service staff. They moved to an even larger apartment, then eventually to a mansion in Riverside Heights, the kind of neighborhood where the houses had names instead of numbers and the lawns looked like they'd been manicured with scissors. Sophia invited me for dinner exactly 3 times in the first year of their marriage. Each visit felt more strained than the last, conversations carefully steered away from anything that might remind Richard of my working-class background or Sophia's humble beginning. When Sophia announced her first pregnancy, I cried tears of joy and immediately began knitting a baby blanket in soft yellow yarn. I imagined myself as the grandmother I'd always dreamed of being, the one who would babysit on weekends, and teach my grandchild to make tortillas and tell stories about their mother's childhood. I pictured family gatherings filled with laughter and love, 3 generations connected by bonds that money and status couldn't break. Marcus Richard Blackstone was born on a crisp October morning, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces. When I held him for the first time, his tiny fingers wrapped around mine, I felt a love so profound it took my breath away. He had Sophia's dark eyes and my stubborn chin, and I whispered the same promise to him that I'd once made to his mother, that he would never want for love, that his abuela would always be there for him. But Richard had other plans. Almost immediately they hired a team of nannies and baby nurses, surrounding Marcus with professional caregivers who had degrees in child development and references from other wealthy families. When I offered to help with feeding or changing, or just holding him while Sophia rested, Richard would politely but firmly suggest that I leave those tasks to the experts. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, Miss Garcia," he said during one visit, his voice carrying that same false courtesy he'd used at our first meeting. "But we want to establish routines and consistency for Marcus. Too many different caregivers can be confusing for infants." I was not a caregiver, I wanted to say. I was his grandmother, but I bit my tongue and nodded, watching as a stranger in a starched white uniform fed my grandson a bottle while I sat uselessly on the sofa, my arms empty and aching. Sophia's second pregnancy brought Isabella, a beautiful little girl with Richard's blonde hair and a smile that reminded me of Sophia at that age. By then the patterns were established. I was a visitor in my grandchildren's lives, someone to be scheduled and managed rather than someone who belonged. My visits were limited to Sunday afternoons, and only when it didn't conflict with the children's music lessons or playdates with other Riverside Heights families. I bought Marcus books in Spanish, hoping to share my language and culture with him, but Richard insisted that bilingual education would only confuse him academically. I brought Isabella a traditional Mexican doll that had belonged to Sophia as a child, but it disappeared into a closet, replaced by educational toys that promoted cognitive development and fine motor skills. Slowly, methodically, I was being erased from my own family's story. Not dramatically, not with shouting or accusations, but with the quiet efficiency of people who believed they knew better than I did about everything, including love. The final piece of my old life crumbled when I was forced to sell the house on Maple Street. At 70, with arthritis making factory work impossible and only a small Social Security check coming in each month, I couldn't afford the mortgage payments anymore. The house that had held all our memory, where Sophia had taken her first steps and lost her first tooth and danced at her quinceañera, was sold to strangers who planned to tear it down and build something bigger, something modern, something that erased every trace of the Garcia family's 40 years on that corner lot. Sophia offered to let me move into their guest house, a small apartment above the garage that Richard used as an office. "It's just temporary, Mama," she assured me, though we both knew temporary had a way of becoming permanent in situations like this, until you figure out what you want to do next. What I wanted was to matter again, to be needed rather than tolerated, but I didn't say that. I packed my belongings into boxes, donated most of my furniture to charity, and moved into the space above Richard and Sophia's garage like a tenant renting from strangers. The guest house wasn't off. It had a small kitchenette, a bathroom with a shower, and a main room that served as both living room and bedroom. There was even a tiny balcony that overlooked Sophia's rose garden, though I was asked not to use it when Richard was entertaining business associates in the backyard below. I tried to make it feel like home, hanging my favorite photographs on the walls and setting up my sewing machine by the window where the light was best, but it wasn't home. Home was a place where you belonged, where your presence was wanted rather than merely tolerated. Home was where you could cook Sunday dinner for your family without being told that the hired chef had already prepared something more appropriate for the guests. Home was where your grandchildren could visit without their father checking his watch and suggesting that perhaps it was time for their educational programming or structured play. I lived in that guest house for 2 years, watching my daughter's life from the outside like a character in someone else's movie. I saw Marcus grow from a toddler into a serious little boy who spoke in complete sentences and never seemed to get dirty. I watched Isabella develop her father's careful mannerisms and her mother's new habit of looking right through people who didn't meet certain standards of importance. And I felt myself becoming smaller each day, like a photograph left too long in the sun, my colors fading until I was barely visible even to myself. The first Christmas in the guest house, Sophia invited me to Christmas dinner with the family. I spent hours preparing my mother's recipe for tamales, the ones Sophia had always loved as a child, but when I brought them to the main house, Richard's hired caterer had already filled the dining room with what he called elevated holiday cuisine. My tamales went into the refrigerator, untouched, and were eventually thrown away 3 days later when the housekeeper did her post-holiday cleaning. The second Christmas, I wasn't invited to dinner at all. Sophia brought me a plate afterward, covered in plastic wrap like I was an elderly neighbor they were being kind to, rather than the woman who had raised her. I ate alone in the guest house while listening to their laughter drift across the courtyard, feeling more isolated than I had ever felt in my entire life, but I endured it because I believed that love would eventually win out, that Sophia would remember who I was and who she used to be. I believed that my grandchildren would eventually want to know their grandmother's stories, their mother's real history, the truth about where they came from and what their family had overcome. I believed that being patient and grateful and undemanding would somehow earn me back the place I'd lost in their lives. I believed a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. 3 weeks before this Christmas, the third Christmas I would spend in exile from my own family, I stopped at Rodriguez Market to buy groceries. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the store was nearly empty, except for Miss Santos from my old neighborhood and a young mother with twin boys who kept trying to escape from their shopping cart. I picked up a loaf of bread, some chicken for dinner, and on impulse, a lottery ticket from the machine near the register. I never played the lottery. It seemed like a waste of money I couldn't afford to waste, a foolish hope for people who didn't understand how the world really worked. But something about that afternoon, about the gray December sky, and the way the cashier smiled at me like I was just another customer rather than someone's unwanted burden, made me feed $5 into the machine and select the numbers that corresponded to important dates in my life: Sophia's birthday, Miguel's birthday, the day I'd brought my first grandchild home from the hospital. I folded the ticket into my wallet and forgot about it until 3 days later when the winning numbers were announced on the evening news. I was sitting in the guest house, eating leftover soup and half watching a telenovela, when the lottery official began reading the sequence: 15, 23. I stared at the television, my spoon suspended halfway between the bowl and my mouth, as my brain slowly processed what I was hearing. I pulled the ticket from my wallet with trembling fingers and checked the numbers once, twice, 3 times before the truth finally settled over me like a warm blanket on a cold night. I had won $67 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real, like a sum from a movie or a dream. I sat in that small room above my daughter's garage, surrounded by the modest possessions of my small life, and tried to comprehend what had just changed. Not just my financial situation, though that was obvious, but everything. The balance of power in every relationship I had, the options available to me, the way I would be seen and treated by people who had dismissed me as irrelevant, including my own daughter. I didn't call the lottery office that night, or the next day, or the day after that. I kept the ticket in my wallet, and went about my routine as if nothing had changed, as if I was still the same poor old woman who depended on her daughter's charity for a roof over her head. I bought groceries with coupons, mended a tear in my winter coat instead of buying a new one, and said nothing when Sophia mentioned that Richard thought I should consider moving to a senior living facility, because the guest house was needed for his expanding home office. I wanted to see what would happen if I remained invisible just a little while longer. I wanted to understand exactly where I stood in my family's hierarchy before I revealed that the hierarchy itself was about to change forever. What I discovered broke my heart in ways I hadn't known were possible, and what I decided to do about it would break theirs. The decline didn't happen overnight. It crept in like morning fog, so gradual that by the time I noticed how thick it had become, I could barely see the warmth that used to exist between Sophia and me. Looking back now, I can pinpoint when the shift began accelerating, when my daughter's new life started requiring my absence rather than just tolerating my presence. It started with the little correction. "Mama, it's pronounced nuclear, not nuclear," Sophia would say when I was telling Marcus about the science museum we'd visited when she was his age. Her voice carried that patient tone teachers use with slow students, the kind that makes you feel grateful for the education even while it's stings. "I just want you to sound educated when you speak to the children." Then came the wardrobe suggestions. Richard's mother, Patricia Blackstone, was visiting for Easter dinner, and Sophia approached me in the guest house the morning before with a shopping bag in her hand. "I picked up a few things for you to wear tomorrow," she said, pulling out a conservative beige dress with a high neckline and long sleeves. "Something more appropriate for Easter brunch." I held up the dress, studying its expensive fabric and understated style. It was beautiful, I supposed, but it looked like something a funeral director's wife might wear. Nothing like the bright coral dress with embroidered flowers that I'd planned to wear, the one that reminded me of spring and celebrations, and the joy I felt whenever I could spend time with my grandchildren. "What's wrong with what I already have, Mia?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Nothing's wrong with it," Sophia replied quickly. "It's just that Richard's mother has very traditional ideas about presentation. I thought this might be more comfortable for everyone, except me, apparently." But I wore the beige dress and sat quietly through Easter brunch, while Patricia Blackstone dominated the conversation with stories about her charity work and complaints about the help these days. When she asked what I did to keep busy, I started to mention my volunteer work at the local food bank, but Sophia quickly redirected the conversation to Marcus's achievement in his advanced mathematics class. The pattern was established. My stories were too humble, my opinions too unrefined, my very presence a potential embarrassment that needed to be managed. I began to feel like a beloved but unpredictable pet that the family loved in private but couldn't quite trust in public. The changes in how my grandchildren interacted with me were more subtle but perhaps more painful. Marcus, who used to run to me with scraped knees and exciting discoveries, began approaching me with the same polite distance he showed to his piano teacher or the mailman. When I offered to teach him the card games Sophia and I used to play for hours, he informed me that his father preferred he spend his free time on educational activities. "Abuela, did you know that playing chess develops strategic thinking skill?" he asked me one afternoon, with the serious expression of a tiny adult. "Father says it's much more beneficial than regular card games." I wanted to tell him that Go Fish had taught his mother about numbers and patterns, that Old Maid had made her laugh until she got the hiccups, that some of our best conversations had happened over hands of crazy 80s during summer afternoons, when the air conditioning was broken and we had nothing but time and each other. But I just smiled and said, Chess sounds wonderful, Mijo. Isabella, barely 3 years old, was still affectionate with me, still crawled into my lap for stories and called me Buila in her sweet, lisping voice. But even she was beginning to absorb the household's subtle messages about my place in the family hierarchy. When I gave her a small carved wooden horse that Miguel had made for Sophia decades ago, Isabella loved it immediately, galloping it across the coffee table while making happy neighing sounds. But within a week, the horse had vanished, replaced by an expensive educational toy that taught colors and shapes in 3 languages. When I asked Sophia about it, she explained that Richard's pediatrician recommended limiting Isabella's toys to items that promoted cognitive development. The horse was beautiful, Mama, but it didn't really serve a purpose, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. And Isabella has so many toys already. That horse had served the purpose of connection, of history, of love, passed down through generations. But apparently those weren't the kinds of purposes that mattered in the Blackstone household. The guest list for Marcus's 5th birthday party told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in this new world order. 30 children from his private school, their well-dressed parents sipping wine and discussing vacation properties, while a professional entertainer led activities in the backyard. I helped in the kitchen, arranging vegetable platters and refilling ice buckets, grateful to have something useful to do. When one of the mothers asked me how I knew the family, I started to say that I was Marcus's grandmother, but Sophia appeared beside me and smoothly interjected, "This is Angela. She helps us out with events. Isn't she wonderful?" I stood there holding a tray of fancy cheese cubes, wearing the apron Sophia had given me to protect my dress, and felt something inside me shrivel. I wasn't being introduced as Marcus's grandmother, as Sophia's mother, as a person with my own identity and relationship to this family. I was anonymous, interchangeable, useful only for my labor. Later, when Marcus opened his presents in front of the crowd, I watched from the kitchen window as he unwrapped gift after expensive gift. Tablets designed for children, building sets that cost more than my monthly Social Security check, clothes from boutiques I'd never heard of. The wooden puzzle I'd carefully selected for him, carved by a local artisan and painted with bright, whimsical animals, was opened and set aside so quickly that I'm not sure he even saw what it was. That night, after the guests had gone and the hired cleaning crew had restored the house to its pristine condition, I found the puzzle in a box marked donations in the garage, along with 3 other gifts that apparently hadn't met whatever standards the Blackstones used to determine what was worthy of keeping. I rescued my puzzle and took it back to the guest house, where it sat on my small dining table like evidence of my irrelevance. A reminder that my love, my time, my carefully chosen gestures meant less than nothing in this family's carefully curated life. The holidays became particular exercises in humiliation. Thanksgiving dinner was held in the formal dining room, with place cards indicating where each guest should sit. Mine was at the far end of the table, between Richard's elderly uncle who was nearly deaf and a business associate's wife who spent the entire meal taking photos of her food for social media. I had spent 2 days preparing my grandmother's stuffing recipe, the one Sophia had always insisted on for special occasions. But when dinner was served, the table groaned under the weight of dishes prepared by Richard's expensive caterer: organic turkey with truffle gravy, artisanal cranberry sauce, side dishes with names I couldn't pronounce. My stuffing appeared briefly as a small serving bowl that was quickly moved to the kitchen when space was needed for more wine glasses. "Did anyone try Angela's stuffing?" I heard Sophia ask politely as the meal was winding down. A few people murmured appreciatively, though I was fairly certain none of them had actually tasted it. The bowl returned to the kitchen untouched and was later scraped into the garbage disposal while I was helping clear plates. Christmas was work. I had always been the one to put up decorations in our little house on Maple Street, hanging lights around the windows and setting up the modest nativity scene that had belonged to my mother. Sophia used to help me arrange the figures, making up stories about the wise men's journey and singing Silent Night in Spanish while we worked. But the Blackstone house was decorated by professionals who created elaborate displays that looked like something from a magazine. Everything was color-coordinated in shades of gold and burgundy, with expensive ornaments that matched the furniture and fresh greenery that was replaced weekly to maintain its perfect appearance. There was no place for my mother's carved wooden nativity set, no room for the homemade ornaments Marcus and Isabella might have created. When I offered to help with the decorating, Richard's assistant politely explained that the design team preferred to work without interference. I watched from my guesthouse window as strangers transformed my family's home into a beautiful, impersonal showplace that had nothing to do with our traditions or our history. The Christmas Eve party that year was the culmination of my invisibility. Richard and Sophia invited 50 of their closest friends and business associates for cocktails and what the elegant invitation called seasonal festivity. I wasn't invited exactly, but I was expected to be available to help with coats and serve hors d'oeuvres and generally make myself useful in the background. I wore the black dress Sophia had bought me for such occasions, something expensive but unremarkable that would help me blend into the wallpaper. I pinned my graying hair back in a neat bun and put on the small pearl earrings that had been Miguel's last gift to me before he died. I wanted to look respectable even if I was only there to work. The party was everything I wasn't: sophisticated, polished, effortlessly elegant. Women in designer dresses discussed their children's acceptances to prestigious private schools, while men in perfectly tailored suits talked about market trends and investment opportunity. Everyone seemed to know exactly what to say, exactly how to laugh, exactly how to belong in a way that I never could. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, collecting empty glasses and replacing them with full ones from the bartender's station. Occasionally someone would thank me or ask for directions to the powder room, but mostly I was invisible, just another piece of hired help ensuring that the evening ran smoothly. Then I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I was in the kitchen arranging canapés on silver trays, when Richard's business partner James Morrison walked in with his wife. They were looking for a quiet place to take a phone call, and they didn't notice me standing at the counter with my back to them. "Beautiful party," Miss Morrison was saying. "Sophia really knows how to entertain. She's learned a lot since marrying Richard," James replied. "Remember how different she was when they first got together, all that working-class background showing through. Richard's done wonders with her." My hands stilled on the tray of food. "Oh, I know," Mrs. Morrison laughed. "And what about that mother of hers? The little Mexican woman who used to come to everything. I haven't seen her in ages." Richard finally convinced Sophia to limit her involvement, James said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Apparently she was becoming an embarrassment. "You know how it is with those people, they never quite understand the proper boundary." "Well, she's certainly been relegated appropriately now," Mrs. Morrison replied. "I saw her earlier serving drinks. Much better use of her, really. She seems perfectly suited for that kind of work." They laughed together, the easy laughter of people who had never questioned their right to judge others, who had never wondered what it felt like to be dismissed as those people, or perfectly suited for servitude. I stood frozen in that kitchen holding a tray of expensive food, listening to my daughter's friends discuss my relegation like it was a successful business strategy. They talked about me like I was a problem that had been solved, embarrassment that had been properly managed. And the worst part was that they were right. I had been relegated. I had been managed. I had allowed my own daughter to transform me from her beloved mother into hired help, and I had been so grateful for any place in her life that I had accepted it without protest. I finished arranging the canapés with trembling hands and carried them out to the party, where I watched Sophia laugh and charm and play the perfect hostess. She looked beautiful in her emerald green dress, confident and poised and completely at home in this world of wealth and status. When she saw me approaching with the tray, she smiled briefly and took 2 canapés without really seeing me, then turned back to her conversation about vacation homes in Tuscany. I spent the rest of the evening serving food and drinks to people who discussed my irrelevance within my hearing, pretending I was invisible even when I was standing directly beside them. I listened to Sophia's new friends praise her sophistication, her style, her successful transformation from whatever she used to be into someone worthy of their social circle. Not one person at that party knew that the woman serving their champagne had worked double shifts for years to pay for Sophia's education. Not one of them knew that I had taught their hostess how to cook, how to love, how to be strong in the face of adversity. Not one of them would have believed that the elegant woman they admired had once danced on my feet in a tiny living room while I sang lullabies in Spanish. That night, I lay in my narrow bed in the guest house and stared at the ceiling while the sounds of laughter and music drifted across the courtyard. I thought about the lottery ticket hidden in my wallet, about the $67 million that could change everything. Not just my circumstances, but the entire dynamic between Sophia and me. The balance of power that had shifted so gradually, I hadn't noticed until it was too late. I thought about James Morrison's words, "those people," and perfectly suited for that kind of work. I thought about his wife's laughter, about Sophia's easy smile as she took food from my tray without acknowledgement, about Richard's systematic campaign to erase my presence from his family's life, and I began to plan. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in observation. I paid attention to things I had previously ignored, how decisions were made in the household, who held real influence, what motivated each family member's behavior. I listened more carefully to conversations, noticed the subtle hierarchies that governed every interaction. Richard, I realized, was not just wealthy but controlling. He managed his family the way he managed his business interests, through careful allocation of resources, strategic decision-making, and the elimination of inefficiency. I was an inefficiency, a reminder of Sophia's past, that cluttered the clean narrative of their ascent to social prominence. Sophia, meanwhile, had become complicit in her own transformation. She wasn't just tolerating Richard's attitude toward me, she was actively participating in it. When Marcus asked about the Spanish lullabies I used to sing to him, Sophia redirected his attention to his English vocabulary lessons. When Isabella wanted to help me cook, Sophia suggested she practice piano instead. My daughter was systematically erasing her own history, and I was the primary evidence that needed to be eliminated. The final confirmation came during a conversation I wasn't meant to overhear. I was cleaning the pool house windows one afternoon, when Richard and Sophia walked onto the patio below, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. "The situation with your mother has to be addressed," Richard was saying. "Morrison mentioned it again at the club yesterday. Having her serve at our parties sends the wrong message." "I know," Sophia replied, and I could hear the weariness in her voice. "I just don't know what else to do with her. She can't afford to live anywhere else." "There are facilities," Richard said. "Nice ones. Places where she'd be with people more like herself, more comfortable. We could arrange something tasteful." "Richard, she's my mother, and you've been a devoted daughter. But there comes a time when you have to think about what's best for everyone, including the children. They're starting to notice the differences." Marcus asked me yesterday why Abuela talks funny. There was a long silence, then Sophia's voice, smaller now. "Maybe you're right, maybe it would be better for everyone. I'll have my assistant research some options," Richard said. "Somewhere nice, not too far away, you can visit regularly." "Yes," Sophia agreed. "That might be best." I stood at that window with my cleaning rag in my hand, listening to my daughter and her husband plan my exile, and felt the last piece of my old life crumble away. They weren't discussing my future out of love or concern for my well-being. They were solving a problem, removing an obstacle to their social advancement. I was an embarrassment to be managed, not a mother to be on. That night, I pulled the lottery ticket from my wallet and stared at the numbers that had changed everything. $67 million, enough to buy my own house, my own dignity, my own independence, enough to show my daughter and her husband exactly what they were discarding when they discarded me. But first, I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted to understand the full extent of their callousness before I revealed that the balance of power was about to shift dramatically in my favor. I wanted them to show me exactly who they had become, so I could decide exactly what they deserved. Christmas was 3 weeks away, and Richard's family was coming to stay for the holiday. His parents, his sister and her family, various cousins, and business associates, who always seemed to be part of their celebrations. The guest rooms would be full, Richard explained to me with his usual polite coldness, and they would need the guest house for overflow guests. "I'm sure we can find somewhere for you to stay," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Perhaps one of your friends from the old neighborhood could accommodate you for a few days." "What friends?" I wanted to ask. the friends I'd lost touch with when I moved into their garage, the neighbors from Maple Street, who probably thought I'd abandoned them for a fancier life, the community I'd been cut off from by geography and circumstance, and my own misguided loyalty to a daughter who was ashamed of where she came from. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and said I would figure something out. Actually, Sophia interjected, I had another idea. The attic space above the main house is finished, and there's an old cot up there from when Marcus was little. It's not ideal, but it would be temporary, just for Christmas week. She presented it like she was doing me a favor, offering me shelter in their house instead of forcing me to find somewhere else to go. But what she was really offering was a hiding place, a way to keep me nearby for any services they might need, while ensuring I remained invisible to their important guests. The attic, the space where forgotten things were stored until someone decided whether they were worth keeping or should be thrown away. I looked at my daughter as she explained this arrangement, searching her face for any sign of the little girl who used to tell me I was the most important person in her world. But all I saw was a polished stranger who had learned to solve problems efficiently, regardless of the human cost. That would be fine, I said quietly. Thank you for thinking of me, and I meant it, in a way, because her casual cruelty was giving me the clarity I needed to do what came next. Her willingness to literally put me in the attic while she entertained the people she wanted to impress was the final piece of evidence I needed about where I stood in her life. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing, but not in the way they expected. While Sophia and Richard planned their perfect Christmas celebration, I made my own preparations. I researched lawyers, financial planners, real estate agents. I opened new bank accounts and safety deposit boxes. I arranged for secure mail forwarding and set up private communication systems. I also watched. I paid attention to every slight, every casual dismissal, every moment when my presence was treated as an inconvenience to be managed. I cataloged each instance of disrespect, not out of vindictiveness, but out of a need to understand exactly what I was walking away from. Because I was walking away, the lottery ticket wasn't just going to change my financial situation, it was going to free me from this family that had stopped seeing me as a person worth loving. But first I was going to let them have their perfect Christmas. I was going to climb into their attic, accept their scraps of attention, and let them believe they had successfully managed the problem of my existence. And then, when the holidays were over, and their guests had gone home, I was going to show them what they had lost when they chose status over love, wealth over family, appearances over the woman who had sacrificed everything to give them the opportunities they now used to exclude her. I was going to disappear from their lives completely, not because I was ashamed or defeated, but because I finally understood that some relationships can't be repaired, only escaped. And I had the means to escape in style. The lottery ticket sat in my wallet like a secret weapon, waiting for the right moment to reveal its power. Soon, I promised myself, soon, they would understand that the embarrassing old woman they had relegated to the attic was worth more than their entire social circle combined. But for now, I would climb their ladder and sleep in their storage space and let them believe they had won, because the best revenge isn't emotional, it's strategic, and I had learned from the best how to be strategic. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of bitter cold that seeps through walls and settles in your bones. I woke before dawn in the guest house, knowing it would be my last morning in the small space that had never quite felt like home, but had at least been mine. Outside my window, snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, the kind that would make the Blackstone mansion look even more like a picture postcard. When Richard's family arrived, later that afternoon, I packed my few belongings slowly, deliberate. The worn suitcase that had traveled with me from Maple Street to this garage apartment held everything I would need for the next week: my warmest sweaters, an extra blanket, the medications that kept my arthritis manageable, and hidden in the zippered compartment, the lottery ticket that would change everything once Christmas was over. I tucked my mother's rosary into my coat pocket, along with the small photograph of Sophia as a child that I carried everywhere, even though looking at it had become more painful than comforting. The main house was already buzzing with activity when I knocked on the kitchen door. Maria, the housekeeper Richard had hired for the holidays, let me in with a harried smile. She was a woman about my age, though she looked older, worn down by years of cleaning up after people who barely acknowledged her existence. We had developed a quiet friendship over the past few months, two invisible women, navigating the same household hierarchy. "Señora Angela," she whispered in Spanish, "they have been asking for you. The little beds need to be set up in the children's rooms for the cousin." I nodded and made my way through the house, noting how every surface gleamed with professional cleaning, how every room had been arranged to perfection for the family's arrival. The Christmas tree in the living room was a 12-foot Douglas fir, decorated with ornaments that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Beneath it, wrapped presents were arranged in careful groups, each pile designated for a specific family member with color-coded ribbon. There was no pile for me. There never was any more. Sophia appeared in the doorway wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and perfectly pressed slacks, her hair styled in the kind of effortless waves that actually required an hour with a professional stylist. She looked beautiful and stressed, the way she always did when Richard's family was coming. His parents had a way of making everyone feel like they were being evaluated, and Sophia had never quite gotten over her fear of failing their test. "Oh good, you're here," she said, checking something off a list on her phone. "Could you help Maria with the extra linens? And Richard's cousin's children are lactose intolerant, so we'll need to make sure there are alternative milk options set up for breakfast." I waited for her to ask how I was, whether I needed anything for my stay in the attic, if I was comfortable with the arrangements they had made for me. But she was already moving on to the next item on her list, her mind completely occupied with the logistics of impressing people who would judge her harshest for any sign that she hadn't completely shed her working-class origins. "Of course, Mia," I said quietly, "whatever you need." She paused then, something in my tone perhaps catching her attention. For a moment, she looked at me with what might have been concern, or maybe just the mild curiosity you might show a service worker who seemed slightly off their game. "Are you feeling all right, Mama? You look tired." It was the first time in weeks she had asked about my well-being, and the casual way she said it while continuing to scroll through her phone told me everything I needed to know about how much my answer actually mattered to her.
"I'm fine," I replied.
"Just a little anxious about sleeping somewhere new." "Ooh. The attic will be fine," she said dismissively. "It's actually quite cozy once you get used to it. And it's only for a few days." Cozy, as if banishing your 71-year-old mother to an unheated storage space was a charming adventure rather than a calculated humiliation. I spent the morning helping Maria prepare for the invasion. We made beds with Egyptian cotton sheets that felt softer than anything I had ever owned, arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases, and polished silver that would be used once and then immediately cleaned and put away again. The luxury was overwhelming, but it felt hollow, like a beautiful stage set with no real life behind it. Marcus and Isabella were excited about their cousin's arrival, running through the house in their matching Christmas Eve outfits and chattering about the games they would play and the presents they might receive. When they saw me, they were polite but distant, the way children are with family employees. They've been taught to treat kindly but not to consider as important as the adults they really answer to. "Abuela, are you sleeping in the house tonight?" Isabella asked, tugging on my skirt with sticky fingers that immediately left marks on the dark fabric. "Yes, mi amor," I said, kneeling down to her level. "I'll be upstairs if you need anything." "In the guest room?" Marcus asked, looking confused. "But Father said the cousins are sleeping in the guest rooms."
"I'll be in the attic,"
I explained, trying to keep my voice light and matter-of-fact. "Like a special adventure?" Marcus frowned, his 8-year-old mind processing this information with the kind of literal clarity that adults had learned to avoid. "But the attic is where we put things we don't use anymore." "Why would you sleep there?" Before I could answer, Sophia appeared and smoothly redirected the conversation. "Abuela is helping us make room for all our guests," she told the children. "It's very thoughtful of her. Now go wash your hands. Your cousins will be here soon." The children ran off, but Marcus's question echoed in my mind. "Why would you sleep there?" "Because that's where your mother thinks I belong," I thought, with the things that aren't used anymore. The Blackstone family convoy arrived at 4 o'clock in a parade of expensive cars that crunched through the fresh snow like a procession of royal. Richard's parents, Harold and Patricia, emerged from their silver Mercedes looking exactly like what they were. People who had never questioned their right to judge others and find them wanting. Harold was tall and distinguished, with the kind of authoritative bearing that comes from generations of inherited wealth. Patricia was elegant and cold, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her smile sharp enough to cut glass. Richard's sister Caroline followed with her husband David and their twin boys, perfect little replicas of their parents in their miniature blazers and carefully styled hair. Behind them came various cousins and business associates, all bearing expensive gifts and the kind of casual confidence that money provides. I watched from the kitchen window as Richard and Sophia greeted their guests with the kind of warmth reserved for people whose approval actually mattered. There were embraces and exclamations, compliments on the house decorations and admiration for how wonderful everyone looked. It was a performance of family happiness, choreographed and rehearsed until every gesture looked natural. "Angela," Richard called to me as the group moved toward the front door, "could you help with the luggage?" Of course. I was the help. I followed the parade of guests into the house, collecting coats and bags while they settled into the living room for cocktails and conversation. No one introduced me, though Harold nodded politely when I took his cashmere overcoat. The kind of acknowledgement you might give to any competent service worker. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, with the good china and crystal glasses that sparkled under the chandelier's light. I helped Maria serve the courses while the family discussed their business ventures, travel plans, and the achievements of their various children. The conversation flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to even if I had been invited to participate: private schools and country clubs, investment strategies and vacation property. At one point, Caroline mentioned her boys' acceptance to an exclusive summer camp that specialized in leadership development for future entrepreneurs. "It's so important to start building those networks early," she said, cutting into her organic beef tenderloin. "The connections they make now will serve them their entire lives." "Absolutely," Patricia agreed. "Though of course, the most important thing is ensuring they understand their responsibilities to their class. Too many young people today think success means abandoning where they came from." She said this while looking directly at Sophia, and I saw my daughter's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The message was clear. Some people could transcend their origins, but only if they completely severed ties with anything that might remind others of their humble beginning, including mothers who spoke with accents and worked in factories. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room for Christmas Eve traditions that had apparently been established without any input from the woman who had raised the hostess. Richard read from a leather-bound book of Christmas stories while the children sat in a perfect semicircle, their hands folded, and their attention focused with the kind of discipline that suggested this performance was as much for the adults as for them. I finished cleaning the kitchen and realized that no one had told me when or how I was supposed to retreat to the attic. Was I expected to simply disappear, to excuse myself like a servant who had completed her duties for the evening? Or was I supposed to wait for some signal that my presence was no longer required? The decision was made for me when Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway with a small bundle in her hands. "Here's a pillow and an extra blanket for tonight," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The ladder to the attic is in the hallway closet. There's a pull-down access panel with a cord." She handed me the bedding like she was checking an item off her mental list. No apology for the accommodations. No acknowledgement that this was unusual or uncomfortable. No recognition that she was asking her elderly mother to climb a ladder and sleep in an unheated storage space during the coldest week of the year. "Thank you," I said, accepting the blanket and pillow. "What time should I come down in the morning?" "Let's say 8:30, she replied. "We'll need help with breakfast for everyone." Of course we would. Because my value in this house was purely functional now, measured by my ability to serve food and clean up messes and remain invisible when more important people were talking. I waited until the family had settled into their evening activities before making my way to the hallway closet. The cord for the attic access was exactly where Sophia had said it would be, and when I pulled it, a wooden ladder unfolded with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Above, a dark opening beckoned like a mouth waiting to swallow me. The climb was harder than I had expected. My arthritic joints protested with each rung, and the thin pillow and blanket made it difficult to maintain my grip. Halfway up, I had to pause to catch my breath, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation and laughter drifting from the living room below. They were probably sharing family memories, telling stories about Christmases past, creating new traditions that would be repeated for years to come. None of those memories would include me. The attic was exactly what I had expected, a large, unfinished space with exposed beams and insulation hanging between the joists like spiderweb. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, labeled with neat handwriting that cataloged the detritus of the family's life. Marcus, baby clothes, holiday decorations, backup, Richard's college book. In one corner sat the narrow cot that Sophia had mentioned, probably 20 years old and barely wide enough for a child, let alone an adult. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, and there was no heat source except for the weak warmth that might eventually rise from the rooms below. I spread the thin blanket over the cot's bare mattress and tried to arrange the pillow in a way that might provide some comfort for my neck. Through a small window at the far end of the space, I could see snow still falling steadily, adding to the accumulation that would make Christmas morning look magical from inside the warm house below. I lay down on the cot fully clothed, pulling my coat over the inadequate blanket, and trying to find a position that didn't aggravate my arthritis. The mattress was thin and lumpy, and every time I moved, the old frame creaked loudly enough that I worried about disturbing the guests in the rooms below. Not that anyone would probably notice if I did. I was out of sight, and as far as they were concerned, out of mind. From somewhere beneath me, I could hear the murmur of ongoing conversation, occasional bursts of laughter, and the clink of crystal glasses being refilled with expensive wine. They were having a wonderful time, this family that I had helped create and support and sacrifice. They were making memories that would last their entire lives, celebrating traditions that bound them together in ways that money couldn't buy. And I was lying in their attic like a discarded Christmas decoration, waiting for morning so I could come down and serve them breakfast. The cold seeped through my coat and blanket, settling into my bones with a persistence that made sleep impossible. I tried to distract myself by mentally reviewing my plans for after Christmas, the new life I would build with lottery money that would give me independence and dignity, and the right to choose how I spent my remaining years. But the fantasy felt distant and unreal in the immediate discomfort of my circumstances. Around midnight, the house finally grew quiet as the family settled into their comfortable beds with their warm blankets and their clear conscience. I pulled my mother's rosary from my coat pocket and began to pray, not for forgiveness or patience or understanding, but for the strength to remember that this was temporary, that in a few days, everything would change, that I would never again allow anyone to treat me as disposable. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the cold and by the sounds of the old house settling around me. Once I heard footsteps in the hallway below, and held my breath, wondering if someone was coming to check on me or perhaps realized how inappropriate this arrangement really was. But the footsteps passed without pausing, probably just someone going to the bathroom or checking on their children. No one was thinking about the old woman in the attic. I woke before dawn on Christmas morning, stiff and cold and aching in ways that had nothing to do with my arthritis. The small window showed a world transformed by snow, everything clean and white and beautiful. It was the kind of Christmas morning that children dream about, perfect for making snowmen, and having cocoa by the fire and opening presents surrounded by people who love you. I climbed down the ladder carefully, my joints protesting after a night on the inadequate mattress. The house was still quiet, the family sleeping peacefully in their warm beds, while I made my way to the kitchen to begin preparations for their perfect Christmas breakfast. Maria was already there, looking as tired as I felt. She had slept in the small room off the kitchen that was designated for household staff during large events, a space that was at least heated and furnished with a proper bed. When she saw me, her eyes widened with something that looked like shame. "Señora, you look frozen," she whispered in Spanish. "How was the attic?" "Cold," I replied honestly. "But I survived." She shook her head sadly. "This is not right. You are family, not staff." But that was where she was wrong. I wasn't family anymore. Not in any way that mattered. Family members don't sleep in attics while strangers occupy the guest rooms. Family members aren't hidden away when important people come to visit. Family members aren't treated like inconvenient problems to be managed and minimized. I was staff now, and poor staff at that. The kind who could be relegated to storage spaces and expected to be grateful for the privilege. We worked together to prepare breakfast for 12 people, fresh fruit salads, artisanal pastries, organic coffee, and the kind of elaborate spread that would look effortless, but had required hours of early morning preparation. By 7:30 everything was ready and waiting for the family to make their grand entrance into Christmas morning. They came down in waves, the children first with their excited chatter about Santa's visit, followed by the adults in their carefully coordinated Christmas morning outfit. Everyone looked rested and happy, and ready to embrace the magic of the holiday. "Merry Christmas, Mama," Sophia said. When she saw me arranging coffee cups on the sideboard, she leaned over and gave me a quick peck on the cheek, the kind of gesture that looked affectionate, but felt perfunctory. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," I lied, because what else was I supposed to say? That I had spent Christmas Eve freezing in their storage space while they celebrated downstairs, that I felt more like an unwelcome stranger than a beloved family member. "Wonderful," she replied, already moving on to greet her in-laws and ensure that everyone had everything they needed for their perfect Christmas morning. Breakfast was served buffet-style in the dining room, with everyone filling their plates and finding seats around the extended table. I moved between the kitchen and dining room, refilling coffee cups and replacing empty serving dishes, invisible except when someone needed something. The conversation was animated and warm, full of family jokes and shared memories that didn't include me. When Harold Blackstone asked about my background, I waited for Sophia to explain that I was her mother, that I had raised her as a single parent and worked multiple jobs to put her through school. Instead, she gave a vague smile and said, "Angela helps us with entertaining. She's wonderful with event management." Event management, that's what my lifetime of love and sacrifice had been reduced to in my daughter's description of me to her father-in-law. After breakfast, the family gathered in the living room for the grand present opening ceremony. The children shrieked with delight as they unwrapped expensive toys and gadgets, while the adults exchanged gifts that had clearly been chosen by personal shoppers rather than with any real thought or care. Everything was beautiful and costly and completely impersonal. I watched from the doorway, cleaning dishes and observing the family traditions that had developed without any input from me. There were no homemade gifts, no family recipes, no stories about Christmases past that included the woman who had created many of Sophia's earliest holiday memories. It was as if her life had begun when she married Richard, and everything that came before was irrelevant backstory that wasn't worth preserving. When Marcus opened a large box and pulled out an expensive gaming system, he looked around the room with excitement. "This is the best Christmas ever," he announced. "Thank you, Santa." Patricia Blackstone smiled indulgently. "Santa had a lot of help from your parents, dear. They work very hard to make sure you have everything you need. They work very hard." As if Sophia's success had materialized out of thin air, as if there hadn't been decades of someone else's work and sacrifice that had made her achievements possible. I finished the dishes and retreated to the kitchen, where Maria was preparing for the elaborate Christmas dinner that would be served later that afternoon. Through the window I could see the family building a snowman in the backyard, laughing and throwing snowballs while their breath created small clouds in the cold air. They looked like the perfect family blessed with wealth and health and happiness, and they were perfect. I realized my presence would only have complicated the picture, introduced questions about class and background that were better left unexamined. I was the piece that didn't fit, the reminder of realities that this family had worked hard to leave behind. That evening, after Christmas dinner had been served and cleaned up, after the guests had retired to their warm beds for another comfortable night's sleep, I climbed the ladder to the attic for the second time. My body ached more than it had the night before, and the prospect of another night on the narrow cot filled me with a despair so deep it felt like drowning. But as I settled onto the thin mattress and pulled my coat over my shoulders, I thought about the lottery ticket hidden in my suitcase. $67 million, enough to buy my own mansion, my own staff, my own perfect Christmas mornings, where I was the one being served instead of serving others, enough to show my daughter exactly what she had thrown away when she chose to exile me to the attic. I pulled out my phone and quietly researched luxury senior living communities, private estates for sale, and high-end concierge services. I looked at properties that cost more than Richard made in a year, apartments with panoramic views and full-time staff and waiting lists that money could bypass. I imagined myself in spaces designed for comfort and dignity, surrounded by people who valued experience and wisdom rather than dismissing it as embarrassing baggage. Tomorrow, I decided, tomorrow I would begin the process of claiming my winnings and building a new life. A life where I would never again sleep in someone's storage space, never again be treated as an inconvenience to be managed, never again have to pretend that cruelty was kindness, as long as it was delivered politely. I had spent Christmas Eve and Christmas Day being treated like an unwanted piece of furniture, stored in the attic until someone decided whether I was worth keeping or should be thrown away. But I wasn't furniture. I wasn't a problem to be solved or an embarrassment to be hid. I was Angela Garcia and I was worth $67 million. More importantly, I was worth dignity, respect and the right to choose how I spent whatever years I had left. And I was going to choose to spend them somewhere far away from people who had forgotten how to love without conditions, who measured worth by bank accounts rather than by the hearts that had broken to build their success. The snow continued to fall outside the small attic window, covering the world in a pristine blanket that made everything look clean and new. Soon, I thought, I would be clean and new too. I would shed this old life like a snake shedding its skin, and emerge into something bright and powerful and free. But for now I lay in the cold darkness, and counted the hours until I could begin my transformation from unwanted family burden to independent woman of me. The best revenge I had learned wasn't served cold, it was served with interest compounded over time, with the patience to let people reveal exactly who they really were before you showed them exactly what they had lost. And Christmas morning, for all its beauty and tradition and family warmth, had revealed everything I needed to know about where I stood in my daughter's hierarchy of values. At the very bottom, apparently, in the attic with the other things that were no longer useful enough to deserve a place in the main house, but not for much longer. The morning after Christmas dawned gray and bitter, with the kind of wind that rattles windows and makes you grateful for warm space. I woke in the attic before sunrise, my body stiff from another night on the inadequate cot, but my mind clearer than it had been in months, perhaps years. Something had crystallized during those long cold hours of Christmas night, something that went beyond anger or hurt feelings into a realm of pure practical determination. I was done being man. I climbed down the ladder for what I hoped would be the last time, my joints protesting but my spirit oddly light. The house was still quiet, the aftermath of Christmas celebration hanging in the air like expensive perfume and the lingering scent of last night's prime rib. In the kitchen, Maria was already preparing coffee for the extended family, her movements efficient and silent. "Buenos dias, señora," she whispered, glancing toward the hallway to make sure we weren't overheard. "You look different this morning." "I feel different," I replied, and it was true. I felt like someone who had finally stopped pretending that a situation would improve if she just waited long enough, hoped hard enough, or made herself small enough to avoid causing problems. I helped Maria set up the breakfast buffet with the kind of attention to detail that came from decades of making sure other people's needs were met before my own. But this time, I was paying attention to everything: the cost of the organic berries that most people would eat without thinking, the price of the imported coffee that would be consumed in casual conversation, the expense of maintaining a household where every meal looked like a spread from a luxury magazine. When the family began drifting downstairs, I served them with the same invisible efficiency I had perfected over the past few years. But now I was observing them differently, studying their habits and attitudes, with the cool assessment of someone who would soon be operating from a position of power rather than dependence. Richard emerged first, already dressed in slacks and a cashmere sweater despite the early hour, checking his phone with the focused intensity of someone whose business interests never truly slept. He accepted his coffee without acknowledgement, the way he might take a newspaper from a doorstep, and settled into his chair to review what appeared to be investment report. Patricia Blackstone appeared next, elegant even in her silk robe and perfectly styled hair that suggested she had either slept sitting up or had access to a hairdresser at 6 in the morning. She surveyed the breakfast spread with the critical eye of someone accustomed to finding fault, then made subtle adjustments to the placement of serving spoons and napkins. "The presentation is lovely," she said to no one in particular, though perhaps the fruit could be arranged with a bit more artistic flair. I made note of her comment and began rearranging the strawberries into a more aesthetically pleasing pattern, not because her opinion mattered to me, but because I was curious about how long it would take before I stopped automatically responding to criticism from people whose approval I no longer needed or wanted. Sophia appeared in a silk pajama set that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, looking relaxed and refreshed in a way that suggested she had slept very well in her heated bedroom with its Egyptian cotton sheets and down comforter. She kissed her mother-in-law's cheek and helped herself to coffee, humming softly as she moved around the kitchen. "Isn't it wonderful having everyone here?" she said to Patricia, her voice carrying the kind of contentment that comes from successfully executing a complicated social event. "The children are having such a magical Christmas. It's been perfectly orchestrated," Patricia agreed. "You've really mastered the art of entertaining, dear." Richard should be very proud. The compliment made Sophia glow with pleasure, and I realized that this was what she had been working toward for years: the complete approval of people who represented the social status she had always craved. My daughter had built her entire adult identity around earning acceptance from individuals who measured worth by bank accounts and pedigrees, who offered love only as a reward for meeting their exacting standards. No wonder she had found my presence increasingly problematic. I was a reminder of a different way of measuring value, one that prioritized connection over achievement, authenticity over performance, love without conditions over approval, that had to be constantly earned. Marcus and Isabella bounded into the kitchen with the residual energy of Christmas morning, their faces bright with excitement as they chattered about their new toys and asked when they could play in the snow. They were beautiful children, smart and well-behaved, but I noticed how quickly they defaulted to their parents for permission for even the smallest decisions. "Can we build another snowman?" Isabella asked, bouncing on her toes. "After you finish your breakfast and get properly dressed," Sophia replied, "and only if you promise to stay where we can see you from the windows." "Will Abuela come help us?" Marcus asked, glancing at me with genuine curiosity. The question hung in the air for a moment, and I watched Sophia's face as she processed the implication. Having her children play in the snow with their grandmother would mean acknowledging my presence to the extended family, creating opportunities for conversation that might reveal uncomfortable truths about our relationship. "Abuela has things to do inside," Sophia said smoothly, "but I'm sure she'll watch from the window and wave at you." Watch from the window. Wave. Like a neighbor who was friendly but not quite family, someone peripheral to their real lives. "Actually," I said quietly, "I need to run some errands this morning. Personal business that can't wait." Sophia looked surprised. In the 2 years I had lived in the guest house, I had never had personal business that couldn't wait, never had anywhere to go that took precedence over the family's needs. My schedule had been completely flexible because my life had revolved entirely around their convenience. "What kind of errands?" she asked, her tone carrying a note of suspicion that might have been warranted if she had known what I was actually planning. "Banking," I replied, which was technically true. "Some paperwork I need to handle in person. On the day after Christmas? Are banks even open?" "Some are," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. It didn't matter. What mattered was establishing that I had business that didn't require their approval or understanding. Richard looked up from his phone for the first time that morning. "Is everything all right financially?" he asked, and I could hear the calculation in his voice. If I was having money problems, it would affect their household budget, their plans for my living situation, their carefully balanced domestic arrangements. "Everything is fine," I assured him. "Just some routine matters I need to address." What I didn't tell them was that I had spent most of the night researching the process for claiming lottery winnings, learning about the tax implications and legal requirements, understanding exactly what steps I needed to take to transform a slip of paper into a new life. I had called the lottery office's automated information line and learned that they had special hours for major winners, appointments that could be scheduled within 24 hours for people holding tickets worth significant amounts. $67 million, I had discovered, qualified as significant. I had also spent time researching lawyers who specialized in sudden wealth management, financial advisors who understood how to protect large winnings from relatives who might feel entitled to a share, and private investigators who could help wealthy individuals maintain their privacy during life transition. Because that's what this was going to be. A transition so complete and radical that the woman who climbed down from the attic this morning would barely resemble the woman who emerged from the lawyer's office this afternoon. After breakfast, I excused myself to get dressed and gather my things. In the guest house, I packed everything that mattered into my single suitcase, leaving behind the furniture and household items that belonged to this phase of my life. I wasn't planning to return here tonight or ever, though I hadn't yet decided how to explain my permanent departure to the family. The lottery ticket rested in my wallet like a secret weapon, its ordinary appearance concealing the extraordinary power it represented. I had memorized the numbers, checked them against the official results multiple times, and even called the lottery office's verification line to confirm that no one had yet claimed the prize for this particular drawing. As of this morning, I was the only person in the world who knew that Miss Angela Garcia was about to become one of the wealthiest women in the state. I dressed carefully in my best wool coat and the conservative shoes that would allow me to walk confidently through whatever professional environments the day might require. I pinned my graying hair back in a neat chignon and applied lipstick with steady hands, creating the appearance of a woman who was accustomed to conducting important business, because I was about to become exactly that kind of woman. Before leaving the guest house, I sat at the small table and wrote a brief note that I left propped against the lamp where Sophia would be sure to find it when she came looking for me later. Gone to handle some personal business, will call later to explain. Please don't worry, Angela. It was deliberately vague, designed to buy me time while giving away nothing about my true intentions. Let them wonder what kind of personal business could take their compliant, dependent Angela away from the house for an entire day. Let them worry about what might have motivated their reliable source of free labor to suddenly develop independence. By the time they understood what had really happened, I would be operating from a position of strength rather than desperation, choice rather than need, power rather than powerlessness. The taxi I had called arrived promptly at 9:30, and I walked past the main house without looking back. Through the kitchen window I could see the family finishing their leisurely breakfast, completely unaware that the old woman they had relegated to the attic was about to transform into someone with the resources to buy and sell their entire lifestyle several times over. The lottery office was located downtown in a building that managed to look both official and welcoming, the kind of place designed to handle large sums of money with appropriate dignity. I had called ahead and spoken to a representative who specialized in major prize claims, a woman named Jennifer who had explained the process with professional warmth. Miss Garcia, she had said, for a prize of this magnitude we prefer to handle the claim privately with appropriate legal and financial consultation. Can you be here by 11? Yes, I had replied, marveling at how simple it was to set in motion something that would change every aspect of my existence. Excellent, we'll have our standard team available, a representative from our legal department, a financial advisor and a tax specialist. They'll walk you through all your options and make sure you understand the implications of each choice. The implications, as if I hadn't been thinking about little else for the past week, imagining how it would feel to walk into expensive stores and buy whatever I wanted without checking price, to look at real estate listings for properties that came with staff and security, and all the privacy that money could provide. The lottery office was quieter than I had expected, with none of the chaos or celebration that I had imagined might surround such momentous transactions. Jennifer turned out to be a woman about Sophia's age, professionally dressed and radiating the kind of competence that comes from handling other people's sudden good fortune on a regular basis. Garcia, she said, rising from behind a polished desk to shake my hand. Congratulations on your remarkable luck. Please, have a seat, and we'll go through everything step by step. The process was surprisingly straightforward. I presented the ticket and my identification, watched as they verified the numbers through multiple systems, and listened as they explained my options for receiving the money. I could take annual payments over 30 years, which would provide steady income but limit my immediate access to the full amount. Or I could choose the lump sum option, which would give me approximately $42 million after taxes. Still more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Most people in your situation choose the lump sum, the financial advisor explained. It provides maximum flexibility and eliminates concerns about future changes in lottery administration or tax laws. The lump sum, I said without hesitation. I wanted complete control over my new resources, the ability to make immediate changes without waiting for annual payments or navigating bureaucratic restrictions. The legal representative, a sharp-eyed woman who looked like she had been protecting lottery winners from their own poor decisions for decades, explained the importance of maintaining privacy around my windfall. Once word gets out about a win of this size, she said, you'll be contacted by relatives you haven't heard from in years, charity organizations, investment advisors, and unfortunately people with less honorable intentions. We recommend keeping the information private until you've had time to establish proper legal and financial protections. I thought about Richard and Sophia, learning that the woman they had exiled to the attic was suddenly worth more than their entire social circle combined. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh out loud. Privacy is definitely my preference, I assured her. The tax specialist walked me through the federal and state obligations that would reduce my $42 million lump sum to approximately $28 million after all withholding. Still more money than I had ever imagined having. Still enough to completely rewrite the story of my remaining years. By 2 o'clock, all the paperwork was complete and I was officially $28 million richer than I had been when I woke up that morning. The money would be transferred to a new account within 48 hours, an account that only I could access, that came with a dedicated private banker and investment services that would help me manage my sudden wealth responsibly. Miss Garcia, Jennifer said as I prepared to leave, do you have any immediate plans for how you'd like to use your winnings? I thought about the attic where I had spent Christmas night, about the casual way Sophia had introduced me as event management help, about Marcus asking why I was sleeping where they kept things they didn't use anymore. I'm going to buy myself some dignity, I said. And then I'm going to disappear. My next stop was the law office of Margaret Chen, an attorney who specialized in wealth management and family law. I had found her through online research that emphasized her reputation for discretion and her experience helping people navigate complex family dynamics involving money. Margaret was a woman in her 50s with the kind of quiet authority that inspired immediate confidence. Her office was elegant but not ostentatious, designed to put clients at ease while making it clear that she was accustomed to handling significant financial matters. Miss Garcia, she said after I had explained my situation, what you're describing is unfortunately more common than you might think. Families often struggle when economic circumstances shift the traditional power dynamic. I want to protect myself legally, I told, and I want to make sure that no one can challenge my right to make independent decisions about my money. Completely understandable. Let's start with a new will that clearly establishes your intention. Then we'll look at setting up trusts and other legal structures that will protect your assets and ensure your wishes are carried out regardless of any family pressure you might face. We spent 2 hours creating a comprehensive legal framework for my new financial reality. The will I drafted left specific amounts to Marcus and Isabella, enough to pay for their college educations and provide them with good starts in life, but structured so that the money would come to them directly rather than through their parents. The remainder would go to charities that supported elderly individuals and women trying to escape difficult family situations. Sophia would receive exactly $1, along with a letter explaining that she was being left a token amount to make it clear that the exclusion was intentional rather than an oversight. This sends a very clear message, Margaret said as we reviewed the document. Are you certain this reflects your true wishes? I'm certain, I replied. She made her choice about what our relationship was worth, now I'm making mine. I also established a revocable trust that would allow me to manage my assets privately while I was alive, with instructions for distribution that couldn't be easily challenged by relatives who might suddenly remember their affection for me once they learned about my changed circumstance. By 5 o'clock I was legally protected against any attempts to manipulate or exploit my newfound wealth. My money was my own, my decisions were legally secured, and I had the resources to maintain my independence regardless of anyone else's opinions or feelings. My final stop of the day was Morrison Luxury Real Estate, a firm that specialized in high-end properties for clients who valued privacy and exclusivity. The agent, David Morrison, was exactly what I had expected: polished, professional, and completely comfortable discussing properties that cost more than most people's lifetime earnings. "Miss Garcia," he said after I had explained that I was looking for immediate accommodation while I searched for a permanent residence, "I have several furnished properties available for short-term lease. What type of environment appeals to you?" I thought about the cramped guest house, the cold attic, the constant awareness that I was occupying space that belonged to someone else and could be taken away at their whim. "Something with privacy," I said. "Space, view, a place where I can think clearly and make long-term plans without interruption." "I have exactly what you need," he said, pulling up listings on his computer. "There's a penthouse apartment downtown that's been recently renovated, floor-to-ceiling windows, private terrace, 24-hour concierge service. The owner is traveling extensively and prefers to lease rather than leave it empty." The photographs showed a space that looked like something from a design magazine: open rooms with soaring ceilings, a kitchen equipped with professional-grade appliances, a master suite with a walk-in closet larger than my entire guest house. The monthly rent was more than I had previously lived on in a year, but that no longer mattered. "I'll take it," I said. "When can I move in?" "I can have the keys ready within the hour," David replied, clearly accustomed to clients who made decisions quickly when money was no object. "The apartment comes fully furnished, including linens and kitchen supplies. All you need to bring is yourself." Perfect. I could disappear into luxury while I decided what came next: where I wanted to live permanently, how I wanted to spend the rest of my life now that I had the freedom to choose based on my own preferences rather than other people's tolerance for my present. At 7 o'clock I stood in my new temporary home, looking out floor-to-ceiling windows at a city that sparkled with lights and possibilities. The apartment was beautiful and quiet and completely mine, a space where no one could banish me to storage areas or treat me like inconvenient furniture. I called Sophia from the penthouse's landline, using a number she wouldn't recognize. "Mama?" she answered, her voice tight with worry. "Where are you? We found your note, but you've been gone all day. Richard is starting to get concerned about whether we need to call someone," as if my absence for a single day indicated some kind of mental health crisis rather than the perfectly reasonable decision to conduct personal business without involving the family that had made it clear I was no longer a priority in their lives. "I'm fine," I said calmly. "I'm staying somewhere else tonight. I needed some space to think." "Space to think about what?" "Mama, you're worrying me. This isn't like you." She was right. It wasn't like the me she had grown accustomed to, the compliant woman who accepted whatever accommodations were offered and remained grateful for whatever attention she received. But that woman had been a diminished version of who I really was, someone who had shrunk herself to fit into spaces that were never designed to contain her fully. "I'm thinking about what I want my life to look like going forward," I said. "I'll call you in a few days when I've had time to sort things out. Mama, please just come home. We can talk about whatever is bothering you. If you're upset about the sleeping arrangements, we can figure something else out." Home. As if the place where I had been relegated to the attic could ever feel like home again. As if the problem was the sleeping arrangements rather than the fundamental lack of respect that had made those arrangements seem acceptable to her. "I am home," I said quietly. "For the first time in a long time, I'm exactly where I belong." I hung up before she could respond, then unplugged the phone so she couldn't call back. Tomorrow I would deal with the complicated process of extracting myself completely from their lives. Tonight I wanted to sit in my beautiful new space and imagine the possibilities that stretched ahead of me like an uncharted map. I ordered dinner from an expensive restaurant that delivered to the building, chose a bottle of wine from the apartment's well-stocked bar, and settled into a chair that faced the windows and the glittering cityscape beyond. The silence was profound and peaceful, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional sound of the elevator delivering other residents to their own private sanctuaries. For the first time in years, I was completely alone by choice rather than abandoned. No one was managing my schedule, monitoring my activities, or determining what was appropriate for me to want or need. I could eat when I was hungry, sleep when I was tired, and spend my time however I chose without consulting anyone else's preferences or convenience. The freedom was intoxicating, but it was also sobering. I was 71 years old, and I had just reclaimed my life at an age when most people were settling into dependence on others. I had money now, enough to buy whatever I wanted, but what I wanted most was something that couldn't be purchased, the sense of being valued for who I was, rather than what I could provide. I thought about Marcus asking why I was sleeping in the attic, about the innocent clarity of a child who could see the wrongness in a situation that adults had learned to rationalize. I thought about Isabella calling me Buella, and crawling into my lap for stories, unaware that her parents were systematically limiting our connection to prevent her from developing the kind of attachment that might complicate their social aspirations. My grandchildren would grow up thinking that grandmothers were people who appeared occasionally to serve food and clean up messes, who lived in storage spaces when they weren't needed for specific tasks. They would learn that love was conditional, that family members could be discarded when they became inconvenient, that worth was measured by social utility rather than by the depth of connection or the history of sacrifice, unless I found a way to teach them something different. But that would require a kind of confrontation I wasn't sure I was ready for, a revelation that would shift the family's entire understanding of themselves and their circumstance. It would mean revealing not just my lottery win but the careful way I had documented and planned my departure from their lives. It would mean showing them exactly what they had lost when they chose status over love, convenience over loyalty, appearances over the woman who had made their success possible. I sipped my wine and watched the city lights twinkle below, and began to plan exactly how that revelation would unfold. Not immediately, not in anger or hurt, but strategically, with the same careful attention to detail that they had used to manage my irrelevance. Because the best lessons aren't taught through lectures or arguments. They're taught through consequences that arrive so naturally and inevitably that they feel like justice rather than revenge, and I was about to teach my family the most expensive lesson they would ever receive about the true cost of taking love for granted. 3 weeks passed before I allowed myself to be found. 3 weeks of living in elegant solitude in my penthouse sanctuary, 3 weeks of adjusting to the reality that money truly could buy freedom, 3 weeks of watching from my high windows as the world moved below me without any demands on my time, energy, or emotional labor. During those weeks, I received 47 phone calls from Sophia, each one increasingly frantic as she tried to understand what had happened to the predictable, manageable woman who had disappeared from their lives without explanation. She left voicemails that evolved from concerned, angry to pleading, a progression that revealed more about her true feelings than any conversation we had shared in years. "Mama, this is ridiculous," she said in one message. "Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made. Now please come home so we can discuss this like adults." In another, "Richard thinks we should call the police. You can't just vanish and expect us to accept that everything is fine. You're 71 years old, for God's sake." And finally, "I don't understand what I did wrong. I've given you a place to live, included you in our lives, treated you like family. How can you repay that kindness by disappearing without explanation?" Treated me like family. The phrase echoed in my mind as I sat in my beautiful new living room, surrounded by furniture that cost more than she had ever spent on my comfort, eating meals that had been prepared by chefs who showed me more respect in 5 minutes than my own daughter had managed in years. I didn't return her calls, but I did listen to each voicemail carefully, analyzing the emotions behind her words. She was genuinely worried, I could hear, but underneath the concern was something else, irritation at having her carefully ordered world disrupted by someone she had classified as a manageable variable. Sophia had built her life around control, around the ability to predict and direct the behavior of everyone in her orbit. My sudden independence represented a threat to that control, a reminder that even the most compliant people could reach a breaking point if pushed too far. During those 3 weeks, I also received visits from private investigators that Richard had hired to locate me. Professional, discreet men who somehow traced my activities to the lottery office, the law firm, and the real estate agency. They were good at their jobs, I had to admit, but they were also bound by legal constraints that prevented them from accessing my new bank accounts or forcing their way into my new residence. When they knocked on my penthouse door, I simply didn't answer. When they called through the intercom, I remained silent. The concierge, well trained in protecting the privacy of wealthy residents, politely declined to provide any information about my comings and goings. But I knew they had found me, and I knew that meant it was time for the conversation I had been planning since Christmas morning in the attic. I called Sophia on a Tuesday evening in mid-January, using my new cell phone with a number she wouldn't recognize. She answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with anxiety and relief. "Mama, is that you? Where the hell have you been?" "Hello, Sophia," I said calmly. "I think it's time we had a conversation." "A conversation? I've been trying to have a conversation with you for 3 weeks. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? How worried the children have been?" The children? It was interesting that she mentioned them, since Marcus and Isabella had seemed perfectly content during the Christmas holidays, despite my exile to the attic. Children, I had learned, were remarkably adaptable to adult decisions that removed inconvenient people from their daily experience. "I'm sorry you were worried," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything that had happened between us, I didn't enjoy causing her genuine distress, but I needed time to think clearly about our relationship and what I wanted for my future. "What you wanted for your future?" "Mama, you're 71 years old. What future are you talking about?" There it was again. The assumption that my age automatically disqualified me from having desires, plans, or the right to make independent decisions about my life. As if reaching 71 meant surrendering all agency to younger people who presumably knew better than I did about what was appropriate for me to want. "I'd like to meet with you and Richard tomorrow afternoon," I said, ignoring her question. "There are some things I need to explain, some decisions I've made that will affect our family dynamic going forward." "Family dynamic? Mama, what are you talking about? You've been missing for 3 weeks, living God knows where, doing God knows what, and now you want to have a meeting like this, is some kind of business negotiation." 2 o'clock tomorrow," I continued steadily, "at the coffee shop on 5th and Main, the one with the outdoor seating area that's usually quiet in the afternoons. I don't understand why we can't just talk at home. Why all this drama and secrecy?" "Because home is where you put me in the attic for Christmas," I said quietly, "and I'm no longer willing to have important conversations in places where I've been treated as less than family." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if she had hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice smaller than before. "Mama, if you were upset about the sleeping arrangements, we could have discussed alternatives. You didn't need to disappear." "It wasn't about the sleeping arrangements, Minjia, it was about what those arrangements represented. 2 o'clock tomorrow. Please don't bring the children." I ended the call before she could respond, then spent the evening preparing for what I knew would be the most important conversation of my adult life. Not because it would repair our relationship, which I now understood was beyond repair, but because it would allow me to close this chapter of my life with dignity and clarity. The coffee shop I had chosen was perfect for my purposes, public enough to prevent any dramatic outbursts, quiet enough for private conversation, and neutral territory where neither of us held any advantage beyond what we brought to the table ourselves. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a corner table that would allow us to speak without being overheard by other customers. Sophia and Richard arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, both of them looking like they were attending a business meeting rather than a family discussion. Sophia wore a tailored suit and the kind of carefully applied makeup that suggested she was armor herself for battle. Richard looked stern and disapproving, his jaw set in the expression he used when dealing with employees who had overstepped their boundary. They sat across from me without embracing, without the casual affection that might be expected between family members who hadn't seen each other in weeks. The distance was telling, a clear indication that they viewed this meeting as a negotiation rather than a reunion. "Mama," Sophia began, her voice carrying the tone she might use with a difficult client, "we need to understand what's been going on, where you've been staying, how you've been supporting yourself, what this is really about." "I've been staying in a penthouse downtown," I replied calmly. "A beautiful place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the entire city. The monthly rent is more than you spend on your gardening service." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "A penthouse? How exactly are you affording a penthouse on Social Security? I'm not on Social Security anymore, I said, reaching into my purse and withdrawing a manila folder I had prepared the night before. I won the lottery 3 days before Christmas, $67 million. After taxes and choosing the lump sum option, I netted $28 million. The silence that followed was profound. Sophia's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate hope that suggested she was already imagining how this news might benefit her family. Richard recovered first, his business mind immediately grasping the implications. $28 million, he repeated slowly. And you've been living in a penthouse for 3 weeks while we worried about your mental health and financial stability. I've been living in a penthouse while you hired private investigators to track me down like a runaway teenager, I corrected gently. There's a difference. Mama, Sophia said, her voice breathy with shock. Why didn't you tell us? We could have celebrated together. Planned together. This is incredible news, is it? I asked. 3 weeks ago you put me in the attic because the guest rooms were needed for people who mattered more than I did. You introduced me to your in-laws as event management help. You've spent 2 years systematically erasing my presence from your children's lives and your social circle. Why would you assume that my good fortune was something we would celebrate together? That's not fair, Richard interjected, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to using when discussions weren't proceeding according to his preferences. We've provided you with housing, included you in family activities, treated you with respect and consideration. I opened the manila folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper, placing it on the table between us. It was a bank statement showing my current balance, $28,437,000. This is what respect and consideration look like, I said quietly. The ability to choose where I live, how I spend my time, who I associate with, and what kind of treatment I'm willing to accept from people who claim to love me. Sophia stared at the bank statement like it was written in a foreign language. Mama, I don't understand what you're trying to say. Are you angry with us? Are you punishing us for something? I'm not angry, and I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply making it clear that our relationship has changed in ways that can't be undone. You made choices about how to treat me when you thought I was powerless and dependent. Now I'm making choices about how to respond to that treatment. What kind of choices? Richard asked, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. He was beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't going to end with me gratefully returning to my place in their carefully structured hierarchy. I withdrew a second document from the folder, a copy of my new will. I've made arrangements for my estate that reflect the realities of our relationship. Marcus and Isabella will each receive $2 million when they turn 25, money that will be held in trust and administered by my attorneys rather than their parent. The remainder will go to charities that support elderly individuals and women seeking independence from difficult family situations. The remainder? Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. $24 million, money that will help thousands of people who have been dismissed, marginalized, or treated as burdens by families who forgot the value of unconditional love. Richard's face had gone pale. This is insane. You're talking about giving away a fortune to strangers while your own family gets nothing. My own family has already shown me what they think I'm worth, I replied. Christmas night in the attic. Remember, when I was literally stored with the things you no longer use but haven't quite decided to throw away. That was a temporary arrangement, Sophia said desperately, a practical solution to a space problem. It didn't mean anything beyond that. It meant everything beyond that, I said. It meant that when you had to choose between my comfort and the approval of Richard's family, there was no It meant that my value in your household was so minimal that sleeping in an unheated storage space seemed like an appropriate accommodation for your mother. I placed a third document on the table. A lease agreement for a luxury condominium in a city 2 hours away, far enough to ensure we wouldn't accidentally encounter each other at social events or family gatherings. I've purchased a home in Coastal Ridge, a beautiful place with a guest suite, a garden, and neighbors who don't know anything about my past except what I choose to share with them. I'll be moving there permanently next week. Moving? Sophia looked stunned. You're leaving, just like that? Just like that? I confirmed. I'm 71 years old, which means I probably have 15 to 20 good years left if I'm lucky. I intend to spend those years surrounded by people who value my presence rather than managing it, who appreciate my company rather than tolerating it. What about the children? She asked, and for the first time her voice broke slightly. What about Marcus and Isabella? They love you. They love the grandmother you've allowed them to know, I said gently. The one who appears occasionally to serve food and clean up messes, who speaks when spoken to and disappears when more important people need attention. They don't know the woman who raised their mother, who sacrificed everything to give her opportunities, who has stories and wisdom and love that could enrich their lives if anyone thought it was worth preserving. We could change that, Sophia said quickly. We could include you more, give you a bigger role in their lives. Now that your circumstances have changed, everything could be different. Now that my circumstances have changed, I repeated. Do you hear yourself, Mija? You're willing to love me now that I have money. You're ready to include me now that I might be useful in new ways, but you never valued me when all I had to offer was myself. I stood up and placed a final document on the table. A bank check for $50,000 made out to Sophia. This is for you, I said. Not because I owe you anything, but because I want to close our accounts completely. Consider it payment for 2 years of housing in your garage, minus appropriate deductions for the meals I prepared, the cleaning I did, and the childcare I provided whenever you needed an extra pair of hands. Sophia stared at the check with tears beginning to form in her eyes. Mama, please don't do this. I know I haven't been perfect, but I love you. We can work this out. You love the idea of me, I said sadly. The convenient, grateful mother who asks for nothing and complains about nothing and accepts whatever scraps of attention you're willing to provide. But you've never been comfortable with the reality of me, a working-class woman with an accent and opinions, and a history that doesn't quite fit the narrative you've built about your success. Richard stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. You're throwing away your family over imagined slights and hurt feelings. Do you really think money is going to make you happy? That living alone in some coastal town is going to be better than being part of your daughter's life? I think dignity is going to make me happy, I replied. I think being valued for who I am rather than what I can provide is going to make me happy. I think waking up each morning without wondering how I've disappointed people, or what I need to do differently to earn basic respect, is going to make me profoundly happy. I picked up my purse and prepared to leave. My attorneys will be in touch about transferring the children's trust funds. Everything else has been arranged to ensure minimal contact between us going forward. Wait, Sophia called out as I turned to go. What am I supposed to tell Marcus and Isabella? How do I explain that their grandmother has abandoned them? I paused and looked back at her, this beautiful, successful woman who had somehow learned to equate love with control, worth with social status, family with performance. Tell them the truth, I said. Tell them that sometimes people make choices about how to treat each other, and sometimes those choices have consequences that can't be undone. Tell them that their grandmother decided she deserved better than an attic, and that she hopes they'll remember that lesson when they're making choices about how to treat people they claim to love. I walked away from that coffee shop and never looked back. Not once in the 6 months that followed, not even when Maria contacted me through my attorney to tell me that Sophia had suffered what she described as a complete emotional breakdown after our meeting. Apparently, the reality of losing $24 million had been devastating enough, but the reality of losing her mother over her own choices had been something else entirely. My new life in Coastal Ridge unfolded like a beautiful dream that I was finally old enough and wise enough to appreciate fully. The condominium I purchased was everything I had ever wanted: spacious rooms filled with natural light, a kitchen where I could cook for pleasure rather than obligation, a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers according to my own preferences. But more than the physical space, I treasured the emotional freedom that came with being exactly who I was, without apology or explanation. My neighbors knew me as Angela Garcia, the woman who volunteered at the literacy center and grew the most beautiful tomatoes in the community garden. They had no idea about my past struggles or my current wealth, and they valued my friendship based on my character rather than my circumstances. I made friends easily in my new environment, perhaps because I was no longer carrying the weight of constant disappointment and rejection. There was Margaret, a retired teacher who shared my love of mystery novels. There was James, a widower who taught me to play bridge and made me laugh with his stories about his grandchildren. There was Susan, a former nurse who organized community service projects and appreciated my willingness to contribute both time and resources to causes that mattered. These people saw me as a complete person rather than a problem to be managed. They asked for my opinions and listened to my responses. They invited me to dinner parties and cultural events because they enjoyed my company, not because they needed someone to help with the cooking and cleaning. For the first time in years, I felt valuable in ways that had nothing to do with my usefulness to other people. I also discovered the profound satisfaction that comes from philanthropy done properly. Through my attorneys, I established scholarships for first-generation college students, funded programs that provided housing assistance to elderly women, and supported organizations that helped families navigate the complex dynamics of caregiving and independence. Every check I wrote, every program I funded, every life I helped improve, was a small act of resistance against the idea that age made people disposable, that family loyalty was a one-way street, that love should be rationed based on social convenience. 6 months after my conversation with Sophia and Richard, I received a letter forwarded through my attorney's office. It was from Marcus, written in the careful handwriting of an 8-year-old, who had been coached on what to say. Dear Abuela, Mama says you moved away because you needed space to think. I miss you. I hope you are happy in your new house. I learned how to play chess, but I still remember the card games you taught me. Love, Marcus. I cried when I read that letter, not because I regretted my choices, but because I mourned the relationship we might have had if his parents had been willing to see me as more than an inconvenience to be managed. Marcus would grow up without knowing his grandmother's stories, without learning the strength that comes from understanding where you came from, without the particular kind of love that spans generations, when it's allowed to flourish. But he would also grow up in a household that had learned, perhaps too late, that taking people for granted comes with costs that can't be calculated until the bills come due. I wrote back to Marcus, a gentle letter that focused on my hope for his happiness and success, rather than on the circumstances that had separated us. I told him I was proud of his chess achievements and that I thought about him often. I didn't mention the trust fund that would change his life when he turned 25, the money that would give him choices his parents never expected him to have. That would be a surprise for another day, another chapter in the long story of consequences and choices that we all write with our daily decisions about how to treat each other. As for Isabella, she was still too young to understand what had happened, but I hoped that someday she would remember her abuela with warmth rather than sadness, as someone who had made a difficult choice to value herself when no one else would. On my 72nd birthday, I woke up in my own bed in my own home, surrounded by my own things arranged according to my own preferences. I made myself breakfast without checking anyone else's schedule, dressed in clothes I had chosen without considering whether they met anyone else's standards of appropriateness, and spent the day exactly as I wanted to spend it. Margaret brought me flowers from her garden. James called to wish me happy birthday and invite me to dinner at his favorite restaurant. Susan organized a small party with our book club friends, women who had become more genuinely supportive of me in 6 months than my daughter had been in years. It was a perfect birthday, not because everything was expensive or elaborate, but because it was chosen rather than imposed, celebrated rather than endured, filled with people who valued my presence rather than managing it. That evening, as I sat on my terrace watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I thought about the lottery ticket that had changed everything. Not because of the money, though the financial freedom was wonderful, but because it had given me the courage to value myself enough to walk away from people who couldn't see my worth. I thought about Christmas Eve in the attic, about the cold and the thin mattress and the sounds of celebration that drifted up from the family that had exiled me to storage. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different woman in a different world, because in many ways it had. The woman who had climbed that ladder with a pillow and blanket had been someone who still believed that endurance was love, that accepting mistreatment was loyalty, that being grateful for scraps was the same as being valued. The woman who sat on this terrace with a glass of excellent wine and a view of the ocean was someone who had learned that love without respect is worthless, that family obligations should flow both ways, that dignity is not a luxury but a necessity for anyone who wants to live fully rather than merely survive. My phone rang as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and for a moment I thought it might be Sophia calling to wish me happy birthday, to attempt some kind of reconciliation, or at least acknowledgement of the day that had brought me into the world. But it was James, asking if I wanted to join him and some other friends for a nightcap at the hotel bar down the street. People who valued my company enough to include me in spontaneous celebrations, who treated my birthday as an occasion worth marking not because they felt obligated, but because they genuinely cared about my happiness. I'd love to, I said, and meant it completely. As I gathered my sweater and purse for an evening out with people who chose to spend time with me, I realized that I had finally learned the most important lesson of my 72 years, that it's never too late to choose yourself, to demand better, to walk away from people who diminish your light in favor of those who help it shine brighter. The lottery ticket had given me the means to escape, but the real prize was discovering that I was worth escaping for. And that, I thought as I locked my door and headed out into the warm evening air, was the kind of wealth that no one could ever take away from me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.